You need to watch this if you crave chills down your spine. Welcome to Soul Studios. Here, true crime meets the unknown. Suspense lurks in every shadow, and supernatural forces whisper from the dark. We craft chilling, edge-of-your-seat short stories inspired by the eerie, the unexplained, and the most haunting mysteries. 3 new stories drop every week, each one darker than the last. Are you ready to step inside? Subscribe now before the next story finds you.
Beneath the calm surface of Lake Ronkonkoma lies a chilling secret, a legend whispered across generations. Young men drown there year after year, their deaths unexplained, their families left in grief. When EMT Daniel Russo loses his younger brother to the lake's mysterious pool, he returns to the water not for closure, but for answers. What begins as a search for peace quickly spirals into a terrifying encounter with something ancient, sorrowful, and vengeful. Inspired by real local folklore, this slow-burn supernatural tale explores the power of grief, the weight of family curses, and the terrifying question, what if some legends are true? If you love immersive, atmospheric horror rooted in true stories and urban legend, subscribe to Soul Studios. We tell the stories you were never meant to hear, and the next one might be waiting just beneath the surface. It was just past midnight on a moonless summer night at Lake Ronkonkoma. The surface of the water lay still and black, a mirror of the starless sky. A lone figure, 34-year-old Daniel Russo, stood on the deserted shore, clutching a flashlight in one trembling hand. He had come here alone, driven by a desperate need for answers, or perhaps closure. The thick silence was broken only by the whisper of a gentle breeze and the soft lapping of water against the dock. Daniel's heart pounded as he scanned the darkness, knowing he was not truly alone. In a few moments, he would come face to face with the terror that had haunted his family for generations. This was the moment he had been led to, the dreadful climax locals chillingly refer to as the drowning hour. But to understand how Daniel found himself here, on the brink of confronting a legendary nightmare, we must start at the beginning. We must go back to the first time the lake's dark pool made itself known in his life. We must revisit the tragedy that put Daniel on this path in the first place. Daniel Russo grew up only a few miles from Lake Ronkonkoma, in a community that treated the lake as both a beloved summer spot and a source of eerie folklore. As a child, Daniel had heard the ghost stories in passing, tales of a vengeful lady of the lake who lured people to watery graves, but he'd paid them little mind. For the Russo family, the lake was simply a place for picnics, fishing trips, and occasionally cooling off on a hot day. Daniel's younger brother, Michael, especially loved the water. Michael was fearless and adventurous, the type of kid who would wade in first and swim out far, calling back to Daniel to follow. Daniel often played the protective older brother, watching carefully whenever Michael splashed into the lake's murky green shallows. He never imagined that the lake's sinister legend would one day entangle his own family. One late August afternoon, 12 years ago, that legend struck. Daniel was 22 and Michael just 16, enjoying the final weeks of summer break by the lake's shore. The sun hung low and golden as the brothers laughed and roughhoused in the water, their mother watching from a picnic table under the trees. Michael, eager to show off, boasted he could swim out to the center of the lake and back. Daniel remembered warning him not to go too far. "Stay where I can see you, Mikey." He'd shouted half playfully, but Michael's youthful pride had already taken over. With a grin and a defiant splash, Michael kicked off and began freestyle stroking toward the lake's depths. At first, Daniel stood in the waist-deep water, hands on hips, watching his brother's arms flash in the sunlight as he swam farther out. Michael's strong, confident strokes cut through the surface, and for a few moments, Daniel felt a mix of annoyance and admiration. Michael was a good swimmer, he'd be fine. Daniel told himself this over and over. But as Michael neared what looked like the middle of the lake, something changed. His distant silhouette paused, treading water. He turned back towards shore, raising one arm as if waving or calling out. Daniel squinted. Was Michael signaling for help? The sounds of laughter and splashing from other beachgoers made it hard to hear. Daniel's heart skipped a beat when he saw his brother suddenly jerk in the water. Michael's head dipped under, then reappeared, his arms flailing now. This was no bravado or trick. Michael was drowning. Daniel exploded into action, plunging forward and swimming as fast as he could. "Hold on, Mikey, I'm coming," he yelled, his voice high with panic. The swim felt endless. Each frantic stroke barely seemed to carry him closer. Halfway there, Daniel sucked in a breath and dove beneath to cut through the water faster. The world went muffled and green. Under the surface, his eyes strained to find his brother. For an instant, Daniel thought he saw something else in those depths. A pale shape drifting near Michael, almost like a person just behind him. A trick of the light? A reflection? Daniel's chest burned for air. He burst back above the surface, gasping. In that moment, Michael vanished beneath the water completely, as if yanked from below. "No!" Daniel choked, redoubling his efforts. By the time Daniel reached the spot, there was nothing but ripples. He dove under again and again, arms sweeping through the limitless blackness beneath him. He called his brother's name until his throat was raw. Other swimmers noticed the commotion. A lifeguard's whistle shrilled repeatedly. Chaos unfolded on the beach as people realized someone was in trouble. Within minutes, lifeguards and a few volunteer swimmers converged where Daniel was, all diving repeatedly into the opaque lake. They searched for what felt like hours. When Daniel was finally pulled, coughing and sobbing, into a rescue boat, the sun had dipped below the horizon and a sickly dusk had fallen. Michael was gone. Rescue divers combed the lake until nightfall and resumed the next morning, but no trace of Michael's body was found that day. It wasn't until several days later that Michael Russo's body finally surfaced, eerily enough, near the dock where he and Daniel had been playing that afternoon. As Daniel's family grieved, whispers spread among the locals. "Another one," they said. "Another young man lost to the lake. By local count, a young man drowns in Lake Ronkonkoma almost every single year. It had happened so often for so long that many in the community murmured about an old curse." Daniel heard these hushed rumors at his brother's wake. "The lady of the lake got him," an elderly neighbor lady whispered when she thought Daniel couldn't hear. "She takes one boy every year to avenge her broken heart or to find a new love in death, so they say." The words made Daniel's skin crawl. In the fog of his grief, the legend that once seemed like a silly campfire tale now felt horrifyingly personal. Lake Ronkonkoma is the largest freshwater lake on Long Island, and for all its natural beauty, it has a dismal history of drowning deaths. For decades upon decades, nearly every year claimed at least one victim, overwhelmingly young men. The pattern is so pronounced that few dismiss it as mere coincidence. Locals point to the legend of the Lady of the Lake, the spirit of a long-dead Native American princess said to haunt the waters. It was this legend that haunted Daniel's nightmares after Michael's death, and which he would eventually investigate with equal parts skepticism and dread. According to the most prevalent legend, back in the mid-1600s, there was a young woman of the Setauket tribe, often referred to as Princess Ronkonkoma, though whether she was truly a princess is a matter of debate. This young native woman fell deeply in love with a man she was forbidden to be with. In one version, it was a European settler, an Englishman who lived near the lake. In another version, it was a member of a rival tribe. Whatever the case, her father, the tribal chief, forbade their union. The lovers resorted to secret meetings across the lake's waters. It said the princess would write letters of love on tree bark and float them from her canoe, sending her words drifting to her lover on the opposite shore. For years, they carried on this way, their love growing in secrecy and desperation. Eventually, their clandestine romance was discovered and forced to an end. Different tellings offer different tragedies. Some say the despairing couple agreed to a Romeo and Juliet pact, both taking their lives rather than living apart. The more famous version, and the one Daniel heard most, speaks only of the princess's lonely end. Heartbroken and enraged by the loss of her love, the young woman paddled a canoe to the center of Lake Ronkonkoma. In her grief, she tied a heavy rock to her body and, with a final curse on her lips, leapt into the dark water. Her life ebbed away in the cold embrace of the lake, her spirit sinking but not departing. In that final act, she, or perhaps those who told her tale, vowed that one young man would drown in the lake every year thereafter, a sacrifice to her sorrow. Thus she became the Lady of the Lake, a vengeful spirit forever bound to the waters that witnessed her heartbreak. Over the centuries, the legend only grew stronger as real tragedies fed into it. People whispered that her ghost, with long black hair flowing like weeds in the water, would lure young men to swim out too far. Sometimes she would appear as a pale woman on the shore, beckoning unsuspecting men into the depths. Other times, an unseen force would simply pull a swimmer under, as if by an invisible hand. Eerily, a local historian tallied that from 1893 to recent times, 166 men have met their end in Lake Ronkonkoma's waters. Few of their deaths had any obvious explanation. Most were strong swimmers in calm conditions, yet something went drastically wrong. And in several cases, the bodies were never recovered where they drowned. In fact, legends claim some drowning victims' bodies mysteriously turn up dozens of miles away, washed ashore in distant waters like the Long Island Sound, or even across the Sound in Connecticut. These baffling recoveries only fueled the belief that the lake was connected to other realms or contained secret underwater tunnels. Others who drowned were never found at all, their bodies seemingly claimed by the lake's endless black abyss. Young Daniel had heard fragments of these stories growing up. His own grandmother once warned him never to swim in Lake Ronkonkoma on the 4th of July, of all days. She claimed the Lady of the Lake was extra hungry for souls during celebratory times. Daniel brushed it off then as just an old-world superstition. But after Michael's death, the legend's details dug talons into Daniel's mind. He spent late nights online, scouring forums and articles for any explanation for the senseless loss of his brother. What he found sent chills through him. Story after story of strange incidents at the lake. A lifeguard who had premonitory nightmares of a drowning that came true on July 4th. A diver who felt a hand brush his arm underwater and barely escaped a powerful force that tried to yank him deeper. A scientist who descended into one of the lake's deep black holes and swore she saw a bright blue light and felt herself entangled in long dark hair for half a minute before something released her. These accounts, told in hushed tones and anonymous postings, convinced Daniel of one harrowing possibility. The legend of the Lady of the Lake might not just be a story. It might be real. In the months following Michael's drowning, Daniel was racked with grief, and something more disturbing, something like guilt twisted with fear. He replayed that day in his mind endlessly, second-guessing every choice. Why did he let Michael swim out so far? Why hadn't he reached him in time? Yet a darker thought gnawed at him too. What if it wasn't just an accident? Daniel couldn't shake the image he thought he'd seen under the water, a pale face, a set of hands dragging his brother down. He hadn't told anyone about that moment, afraid they'd dismiss it as stress or imagination. But Daniel remembered what he saw, or what he thought he saw, and it filled him with dread. Soon Daniel's sleep was taken over by night terrors. In these vivid nightmares, he found himself back at the lake, swimming alone in the ink-black water under a full moon. Sometimes the dream would replay the frantic chase after Michael. Except in the nightmare version, Daniel was paralyzed, unable to move as he watched a pair of slender, ghostly arms wrap around his brother and pull him into the deep. Other nights, the dream was different. Daniel would be standing on the shore at night when a woman's voice called his name from across the water. The voice was lilting, almost musical, but filled with anguish. In the dream, Daniel would step into the lake, the water warm around his ankles, then his waist, then his chest as he waded toward the calling voice. He could never turn back. He was compelled forward, even as every instinct screamed to stop. When the water reached his neck, he'd see a figure rise from the surface ahead, a woman with dripping hair covering her face. she would open her arms as if in welcome. And that's when Daniel would wake up, shaking and drenched in sweat, and more than once drenched in water, as if he'd truly been submerged. The nightmares grew so intense that Daniel dreaded sleep. He began working longer and later shifts as an EMT, taking overnight calls just to avoid closing his eyes. But even in his waking hours, omens of the lake's curse seemed to follow him. One humid evening, as Daniel sat alone in his small apartment, he heard a faint sound of dripping water in the kitchen. He got up expecting to find a leaky faucet. Instead, he found the faucet dry, but the sound persisted. Drip, drip, drip. Looking down, Daniel's blood turned to ice. A small puddle of lake water, it had that distinctive earthy lake odor, was collecting on the kitchen floor with no source in sight. It was as if the water had materialized from thin air. Then, from that puddle, he saw a wet footprint leading toward the front door, and another. A trail of footprints made by bare, wet feet. They stopped right at the door. Daniel yanked the door open and shone his flashlight into the empty hallway. Nothing. When he looked back, the puddle and footprints were gone, leaving the kitchen floor bone dry. Daniel could no longer dismiss these occurrences as stress-induced. It felt like something was reaching out to him, teasing him or perhaps warning him. Another night, Daniel was startled awake by a peculiar noise coming from his bathroom. It sounded like humming, a soft, ghostly female hum, echoing in the tiled walls. As he crept toward the bathroom, he found the door ajar and the lights flickering. The air smelled of damp moss and lilies. Pushing the door open, Daniel's breath caught. Across the bathroom mirror, written in dripping water, was a single word: come. He blinked in disbelief. A trick of condensation? An hallucination of his exhausted mind? He reached out a trembling hand and touched the letters. The drops smeared at his touch, proving themselves real. In that moment, the humming stopped, and behind him he heard a faint splash as if something had just stepped into water. But when he whirled around, he stood in a dry apartment hallway, alone. These paranormal events, subtle but accumulating, made one thing chillingly clear. Lake Ronkonkoma, or the spirit claiming it, was calling to Daniel. The Lady of the Lake, if she existed, had set her sights on him. At first, Daniel feared he was losing his mind under the weight of grief. He confided in no one about the nightmares or the strange phenomena. However, he wasn't entirely alone in his experience. Unbeknownst to him, Daniel's father, Anthony Russo, had started to suspect that their family was cursed by the lake long before Michael's death. About a month after the drowning, Daniel found his father in the attic of their family home, rummaging through old boxes. Anthony emerged holding a faded black-and-white photograph and a bundle of letters. With a grave expression, he beckoned Daniel to sit. "It's time you know the truth about our family," his father said quietly. Anthony Russo explained that Michael wasn't the first young man in their family lost to Lake Ronkonkoma. Daniel listened in astonishment as his father recounted a string of tragedies spanning generations. In the old photograph was a stern-faced man in early 20th century clothing, Daniel's great-grandfather, Salvatore Russo, beside a wooden rowboat on Lake Ronkonkoma. The year scribbled on the back was 1913. Salvatore had barely survived a boating accident on the lake as a young man. His younger brother, Matteo, Daniel's great-granduncle, drowned in that very accident and his body was never found. Anthony then showed Daniel a yellowed newspaper clipping from the 1970s, a headline about a 17-year-old local boy who vanished while night fishing on Lake Ronkonkoma. That boy, Anthony revealed with a trembling voice, was his own cousin, Joseph Russo. Joseph's body also disappeared without a trace in the lake's depths. As Daniel absorbed this revelation, his father's eyes welled with tears. "I tried so hard to keep you boys away from the water," Anthony whispered, voice breaking. "I begged Michael not to go swimming there without me, but he was so headstrong, just like I was." Daniel realized that the eerie pattern of male drownings wasn't just a statistic, it was his family's legacy. 3 generations of Russo men had fallen victim to the lake's hunger. It was as if some malignant force had marked them. Anthony had long suspected the old legend was more than just myth. He confessed that after Joseph went missing, Daniel's grandfather, a deeply superstitious man, insisted their family had been cursed by the Lady of the Lake. The grandfather even sought out a priest and a Shinnecock tribe elder in hopes of performing a cleansing ritual at the lake, but nothing came of it. Anthony himself as a boy had been strictly forbidden from swimming in Ronkonkoma. He obeyed out of fear. But when Daniel and Michael were young, Anthony thought perhaps it was all coincidence or an old man's superstition. He allowed family outings to the lake, albeit cautiously. Now Anthony blamed himself for what happened to Michael. "She's taken from us over and over," he said bitterly, eyes haunted. "I don't know why. Why us?" In that moment, Daniel and his father understood each other's pain intimately. They shared the same mixture of grief, guilt, and now anger. The Lady of the Lake had scarred their family for too long. Daniel felt a spark of resolve ignite inside him. He didn't want to be the next victim, nor did he want to live in fear that one day, if he ever had a son, the curse would come for the boy too. No, it had to end here and now. Daniel decided that he would confront this legend directly. He had no clear plan, no guarantee of success, just a conviction that he must try something, anything, to break the cycle. The drowning of his brother had opened a doorway between Daniel and the darkness of the lake, and strange as it sounded, Daniel felt that the lady was beckoning him to step through. Daniel spent the next several days preparing for a confrontation he wasn't even sure was real. During daylight hours, he scouted the lake's perimeter for a spot that felt significant. He settled on Mallard Point, a relatively secluded area on the lake's northern shore, where a rickety old dock jutted out into the water. It was a spot not far from where Michael's body had finally surfaced. At night, Daniel pored over any texts about banishing spirits or protecting oneself from vengeful ghosts. He packed a small duffel with items he hoped might help: a waterproof flashlight, a length of sturdy rope, a first aid kit, and a silver locket containing a photo of Michael, a personal touchstone to remind him why he was doing this. He also carried an old military knife that had belonged to his grandfather, just in case. The night of the showdown arrived, humid and unnervingly still. The air felt electric, as if charged by an approaching storm, yet the sky was clear. Daniel's parents had begged him not to go through with this. In a tearful goodbye, his mother pressed a rosary into his hand and asked him to promise he'd come back. Daniel lied and said, "I will," because it was easier than admitting he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. As he pulled away in his truck, he saw his mother collapse sobbing into Anthony's arms on the porch, as if they might never see their son again. The image nearly shattered Daniel's resolve, nearly. He steeled himself and drove on into the night, heart hammering with a cocktail of fear and grim determination. By 11:30 p.m, Daniel was at Mallard Point, the only soul in sight. The lake stretched out before him like a void, silent and black. He took a deep breath and stepped onto the old dock. Each footstep on the warped wooden planks produced a creak that seemed deafening in the midnight quiet. Daniel's plan, if one could call it that, was simple: call out to her, provoke a response, and somehow survive it. He wasn't sure if he meant to reason with the Lady of the Lake, or challenge her, or perhaps offer himself in exchange for peace for his family. All he knew was that he felt drawn here, as surely as a tide to the moon. Standing at the edge of the dock, Daniel cleared his throat, struggling to find his voice. "I know you're out there," he called, his voice echoing unnaturally over the water. "I know what you've done, what you've taken from me." He held up the locket with Michael's photo, now hanging around his neck. "You took my brother. You've taken so many brothers, sons, fathers. Why?" His shout faded, and for a moment there was nothing but the gentle slosh of water against the pilings. Daniel's pulse throbbed in his ears. He almost felt foolish, almost. But then came a response. It was soft at first. A ripple on the water's surface, a disturbance where there should be none. Daniel squinted. Out about 20 yards from the dock, the water was churning, forming concentric circles as if something just beneath had brushed up against the surface. The gentle ripple quickly turned into a violent froth, radiating outward. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The epicenter of the disturbance began moving, beelining toward the dock. It cut through the water faster than any swimmer. Daniel fumbled for his flashlight and shone it on the approaching churn, his hand shaking. "Come on then," he yelled, voice cracking between bravado and terror. "Come for me." Suddenly the thrashing water stopped. The surface went dead calm in an instant, as if the lake were holding its breath. Daniel's flashlight beam danced over the ink-black water, illuminating nothing but floating leaves and gentle ripples. A heavy silence hung in the air. Daniel's mind raced. Was it a fish? A trick of the current? Or was it her playing games? He got his answer a heartbeat later. From directly beneath the dock came a loud thump, as if something massive had just struck the boards from underneath. The whole dock rattled. Daniel staggered, nearly losing his balance. Before he could recover, another tremendous thud hit the planks, this one strong enough to split a board at his feet. Daniel stumbled back, eyes wide, and nearly dropped his flashlight into the lake. From the now gaping crack in the dock, Daniel saw a gush of water spray upward. Along with it came hair, long, black, and dripping, snaking up through the crack like a living thing. Daniel yelped and scrambled backward down the dock, but the hair shot out further, tangling around his ankle in a freezing grip. With a yank, it pulled, knocking Daniel off his feet. He hit the dock hard, pain jolting up his hip. In pure reflex, Daniel kicked out at the oily tendril of hair wrapping his leg. He could feel it, impossibly strong and writhing. He dug into his pocket for his grandfather's knife, flipping open the blade. With 2 swift slashes, he hacked through the wet locks, freeing his leg. An otherworldly screech erupted from beneath the dock, inhuman and filled with rage. The tendril of hair recoiled back through the crack and vanished. Daniel knew he had only moments. Adrenaline surging, he forced himself up and ran down the dock toward land. The shore was only a few yards away, if he could just reach solid ground. The entire center of the dock exploded upward in a shower of splinters and water. A figure surged up from the lake, rising through the wreckage of wood and foam. Daniel was thrown forward by a wave of force, sprawling onto the damp grass and sand of the shoreline. Coughing and sputtering, he whirled around to see what had emerged. There, standing, or rather floating, at the shore's edge was a woman. A hideous, sorrowful, mesmerizing woman. She was drenched head to toe, lake water cascading off a tattered white dress that clung to her gaunt frame. Her long black hair hung like a veil over her face, tendrils of it undulating as if still underwater. Although her eyes were obscured by hair, Daniel felt her gaze lock onto him with a palpable hatred and longing. The Lady of the Lake had finally appeared, and now Daniel was face to face with the ghost that had tormented his family for generations. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Daniel was shaking violently, every instinct screaming at him to flee, yet he found himself transfixed by the apparition. The lady's head tilted ever so slightly, as if studying him from behind that curtain of hair. When she spoke, it wasn't with words. Instead, Daniel felt her voice inside his mind, a cold flood of despair and anger that brought tears to his eyes. He sensed her emotions, centuries of loneliness, burning resentment, a bottomless pit of sorrow. In that mental maelstrom, Daniel glimpsed images not his own. A young native woman weeping by a moonlit lake, a white man's face filled with love and agony, a bloody knife, and an endless expanse of dark water where a woman's spirit wandered, aching and enraged. Tears streamed down Daniel's face, whether from sheer terror or from the crushing sadness that emanated from this ghost, he couldn't tell. "I'm sorry," he managed to whisper. Unsure if the thought was his own or pushed into his head by her. Out loud, he said shakily, "I know your story." He wasn't even sure the lady could understand him, but he pressed on, voice quavering. "Princess, I know about your lover, about what happened to you. I'm sorry for it, but please stop this." At that, the lady's drowned face began to emerge as she lifted her head. 2 eyes glowed from behind the hair, glacial blue and filled with unspeakable pain. Her mouth opened impossibly wide in a noiseless wail. Daniel felt a pressure around his body, like an undertow made of air, pulling him toward her. He dug his heels into the wet sand, but an invisible force dragged him inch by inch into the shallows. The water around his feet was swirling, and he realized with horror that if she got him into the lake, he would end up like Michael. Desperate, Daniel fumbled in his pocket for the rosary his mother gave him. He held it up toward the lady. "Let us go," he cried out. "Let my family go. We've suffered enough." The lady paused, her head cocking at an unnatural angle. She drifted closer until she hovered just at arm's length. Daniel could see her clearly now in the faint glow of his dropped flashlight. Skin as pale as the moon, lips blue, and eyes that leaked lake water like tears. Her expression was one of profound sorrow, twisted by fury. She slowly reached out a dripping, skeletal hand toward Daniel's chest, toward the locket hanging there with Michael's picture. Daniel felt his heart flutter as an icy cold seeped through his shirt when her fingers passed through his chest and closed around the locket. For a second, his vision dimmed, and he glimpsed a reflection in the water beside them. He saw himself, but behind him stood the lady, embracing him the way a lover or mother might. It was as though she were trying to take his brother's place in his family to claim Daniel as hers. This thought galvanized Daniel. Summoning a surge of resolve, he did something bold and desperate. He reached up and grabbed the lady's hand. Her flesh felt like frigid jelly, but he held tight, staring back into those glowing eyes. "You don't need to do this," Daniel said, voice firm despite the tears on his cheeks. "You're not alone. You've never been alone. Your story lives on. We remember you." He wasn't sure where these words came from. Part of him was simply babbling, trying anything to break the cycle. "I know you're hurt," he continued, "but my brother, Joseph, Matteo, none of them were him. They weren't your lost love." Daniel's teeth chattered as a wave of grief not entirely his own swept through him. Taking me won't bring him back. For the first time, the lady's horrific expression faltered. The force pulling Daniel forward ceased, though her hand remained in his. She looked almost confused. Under his grip, her form flickered, as if unsure whether to remain corporeal or dissolve into mist. In that brief lull, Daniel felt an echo of empathy pass between them. The lady's mouth closed and her head bowed slightly, as though in sorrow or contemplation. Daniel dared to hope. Was she listening? Was the curse truly about to break? But in the silent seconds that followed, something in the lady's demeanor changed. The fury returned to her eyes tenfold. Daniel sensed that centuries of rage were not so easily soothed by a few kind words. The lady suddenly let out a piercing shriek, one that Daniel heard both in his ears and inside his skull, sending him reeling backward. The lake itself responded. Behind her, the once calm waters erupted into a frenzy of waves and foam. A powerful wave surged forward and knocked Daniel completely off his feet, dragging him under the water. In an instant, he was drowning. Underwater, everything was chaos. Daniel's world became a torrent of bubbles, mud, and darkness. The current was impossibly strong, pulling him away from shore, spinning him end over end. He could not tell which way was up. His lungs burned as he fought the instinct to gasp. Through the dark water, he saw the lady's form drifting closer, her hair spreading out around her like ink. Her eyes were luminescent now, illuminating the depths with eerie blue light. Daniel realized with a surge of terror that this was how his brother must have felt. Trapped, helpless, dragged by something unseen into the abyss. As he tumbled through the water, Daniel's hand brushed against the length of rope still slung over his shoulder from his supplies. In a flash of clarity, he seized it. With the last of his breath, Daniel kicked hard off a submerged stump, one that used to support the dock, and propelled himself upward. Miraculously, his head broke the surface. He was a few yards from shore. Gasping and choking, he sucked in air. The lady erupted from the water right behind him, a whirlpool of wrath in female form. Thinking fast, Daniel looped one end of the rope around a sturdy post fragment sticking out of the water, the remains of the dock's foundation, and the other end he hurled at the lady. The rope unfurled, and by luck or fate, tangled in her outstretched arms. In a split second, Daniel dove away toward land as the lady lunged for him. The rope snapped taut. A howl of frustration echoed across the lake as the lady found herself entangled, the rope tethering her momentarily to the post. Daniel scrambled onto the shore, collapsing on hands and knees, vomiting lake water. He knew this was likely his only chance to escape. Behind him, the lady thrashed, easily powerful enough to break free in seconds. Summoning every ounce of strength, Daniel staggered to his feet and stumbled up the grassy bank toward the tree line. He dared not look back. He could hear the rope tearing against wood, the shriek of the enraged spirit, and the roar of water as the lake itself seemed to rise up in fury. A wave smashed onto the shore, almost knocking him down again. But Daniel lunged forward and grasped the trunk of a large oak, anchoring himself as the wave washed past his legs. The rope bought him only a few precious seconds. With a gut-wrenching snap, the old post in the water gave way, and Daniel heard the lady's shrill cry of triumph as she broke free. In the dim light, he saw her gliding toward the shore, inches above the water's surface. Her form flickered in and out, one moment solid, the next moment a spray of water, then solid again. Like her ghost, couldn't decide on a shape. Daniel pressed his back to the oak tree, chest heaving, knowing he had nothing left to fight with. This is it, he thought. I'm not getting out of this. But at least if she took him, maybe it would end the curse here. Maybe it would spare the next generation of his family. His only regret in that instant was the pain it would cause his parents. The lady drifted onto land, her wet feet touching the grass. Insects went silent, the night sounds of the forest hushed in her presence. She moved toward Daniel, slow now, almost hesitant. Daniel, exhausted and resigned, slid down to sit against the tree, legs too weak to stand. He closed his eyes and murmured a final prayer, clutching the rosary still tangled in his fist. The wind died completely. Even the waves seemed to recede in anticipation. The lady was upon him. Daniel felt the temperature plummet, his breath coming out in white puffs even in the summer night. A brittle, cold hand gently brushed his cheek, wiping away a tear. It was such an oddly tender gesture that Daniel's eyes snapped open in surprise. The lady of the lake hovered over him, inches away. Through the veil of her hair, Daniel saw her face clearly at last, and he gasped. She was beautiful. Not in a human way, but in a tragic, ethereal way. Cheeks sunken, lips the color of dusk, eyes that held the weight of centuries. She looked at Daniel with an expression that was no longer rage, but heartbreak. Daniel realized she did see something of her lost love in him, maybe in his dark hair or the shape of his face, or perhaps just because he dared to empathize with her. For a fleeting second, Daniel felt profound sorrow radiating from her. He understood that the curse was born of unbearable loss and confusion. In her time, she had no justice, no closure, only this endless grief twisted into fury. "It's okay," Daniel whispered, not even sure what he meant, if he was consoling her or accepting his fate. He gently reached up and placed his hand over the cold hand on his cheek. Her skin felt as delicate as ice about to crack. The lady tilted her head, curious, anguished, and then with the softest sigh she began to fade. Her form lost its solidity, becoming mist and water in the shape of a woman. Her sorrowful eyes stayed locked on Daniel's until the very last moment, when they too dissolved into vapor. The ghostly mist lingered a moment longer, then trailed back toward the lake, dispersing over the rippling water. It was over. Daniel was alone on the shore, alive. The night was eerily calm now. Even the water had returned to its glassy, undisturbed state. The only evidence of the confrontation was the destroyed section of dock and Daniel's soaked, shivering body. He remained sitting against the oak, afraid to move or even breathe too loudly, wondering if it was truly done or if the lady would lunge out again. But nothing happened. Only the sounds of night creatures slowly resumed, a cricket here, a distant owl there. It appeared the lady of the lake had retreated, at least for now. Daniel had survived the drowning hour. As dawn's first light crept over Lake Ronkonkoma, painting the sky in bands of grey and purple, Daniel finally rose unsteadily to his feet. He felt completely drained, emotionally and physically. Every muscle ached, and his heart felt heavy with a strange mixture of relief, grief, and a subtle dread he could not quite place. He gathered his scattered belongings from the shore. The locket with Michael's picture was gone, presumably lost in the lake during the struggle. That realization brought a fresh stab of pain. It was as if a piece of Michael was claimed by the lady even as she vanished. Perhaps it was the price for Daniel's life. Daniel's mind swirled with questions as he made his way back to the truck. Had he truly broken the curse, or merely survived one encounter? Had the lady found some measure of peace, or would her rage return with the next cycle of the moon? He had no answers, only the faint hope that his family would be safe from now on. The lake, for its part, lay calm and innocent under the early morning light, belying the violence of a few hours prior. It was hard to believe such a serene body of water held so much darkness beneath. In the weeks that followed, life slowly returned to a semblance of normal. Daniel told his parents a carefully edited version of what happened, that he went to the lake, confronted his feelings, and said a prayer for Michael and the others lost. He did not mention ghostly hair or nearly drowning. There was no need to re-traumatize them or sound insane. Whether they suspected more, he couldn't tell, but they seemed grateful enough that Daniel came home alive. In time, the nightmares that had plagued Daniel began to subside. He even managed to sleep through a night or two without waking in terror. It seemed the lady's hold on him had loosened. For the first time since Michael's death, Daniel dreamed not of drowning or ghosts, but of his brother smiling on a sunny lakeside day. It was a bittersweet dream, but one that left Daniel feeling warm rather than scared. Yet, as any horror enthusiast knows, not every haunting ends so neatly. One late autumn evening, about 2 months after that fateful night, Daniel returned to his apartment after a long EMT shift. The day had been ordinary, comfortingly so. He tossed his keys on the table and clicked on the living room lamp. The soft yellow light flooded the room, and that's when he saw it. Sitting on his coffee table was Michael's locket. The very same silver locket he thought lost in Lake Ronkonkoma. Daniel's heart stuttered. He approached it slowly, every hair on his arm standing on end. How did it get here? He hadn't brought it home. Of that he was certain. With trembling fingers, he picked up the locket and opened it. Michael's smiling face looked back at him from the tiny photograph inside. A drop of water fell onto the picture. Daniel realized his hand was wet. In fact, his whole forearm was damp, as if he had just dipped it in water. Another drip hit the floor. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He looked up at the ceiling, expecting a leak, but there was none. The drip was coming from him. Water was seeping from the fabric of his uniform, which was inexplicably soaked around the sleeves and shoulders. In the quiet of his apartment, he suddenly heard that now familiar sound, a woman's faint humming, just behind him, ghost. Daniel whirled around, eyes darting to every shadow. Nothing visibly moved, but he could feel a presence, one that made the air heavy and cold. He clutched the locket to his chest, and as he did, the lamplight flickered. In the brief dimming, a new shape appeared in the reflection of the dark window, a silhouette standing directly behind Daniel's own. The figure's head was tilted, resting almost lovingly on Daniel's shoulder. Two pale blue eyes glowed in the reflective glass, right next to Daniel's face. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. A chill breath tickled his ear, and a familiar voice, no longer in his head but whispered on the air, spoke one word, dripping with eternal longing: mine. In that moment, Daniel understood the horrifying truth. He had survived Lake Ronkonkoma, but he had not truly escaped it. The Lady of the Lake had followed him back from the depths, attaching herself to him like a parasite of spirit. He was alive, yes, but he would never be the same. He would never be alone again. As the light flickered back on, the silhouette was gone, leaving Daniel standing in terror and understanding that his fate was now entwined with the vengeful soul of the lake. The curse had chosen him as its new vessel, its new tether to the living world, and somewhere, not far away, the waters of Lake Ronkonkoma lay still under the night sky, waiting for the next drowning. Waiting for the next drowning hour, whenever she should decide the time is right. So, what do you think? Was Daniel spared by the Lady of the Lake, or claimed in a way far worse than drowning? Because if what happened at Lake Ronkonkoma is true, then some hauntings don't end when you leave the shore. They come home with you. She doesn't just take the ones she wants. She follows the ones who survive.
Every story has an end, but here, the mysteries never stop. Thank you for watching and being a part of this journey into the unknown. Your support keeps these stories alive, and there's plenty more waiting for you. We drop 3 new stories every week. So if you crave suspense, the unexplained and the downright chilling, make sure you're subscribed and ready for what's next. Until then, keep your lights on, your doors locked, and remember, some stories stay with you long after they're told.